Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome Professor Muhammad Marandi. Professor Marandi teaches at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
If you could give us your first impression of the fifth round of nuclear talks between United States and Iran, which was just concluded, there are some positive comments. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi of Iran said that the United States, the Americans were professional in their conduct during the negotiations, which might be rare given what we saw in the White House with President Ramaphosa, the South African president. But what's your first impression?
It's very difficult to say, uh, but it seems that in private, the Americans are saying something different from what they've been saying in public. And that's the only way I can explain it. Because the Iranians have made it clear, and I have no doubt that Iran will not halt nuclear enrichment. That's out of the question. Even if we go to war with the United States, that's not going to stop. And of course, I don't believe there will be war. War means that the United States will have to bring 1.5 million troops to the region. It's just they don't have the numbers, they don't have the money, and they don't have anywhere to put those troops. They may carry out or try to carry out a few airstrikes. And of course, Iran's air defenses are prepared, and Iran will retaliate heavily. But a few airstrikes or attempted airstrikes is different from a war. It's very different. But in any case, Iran is not going to give up enriching uranium. So, what I would assume is that behind closed doors, Witkoff is saying something that's different from what he's saying in public. Does that shock me? No, because the Trump regime is a regime that flip-flops all the time. They flip-flopped over the trade war. They flip-flopped over tariffs, over Ukraine, over the ceasefire in Gaza, and of course over the Iranian nuclear program many times. Not just Trump himself, but even uh, his aides. We've seen them say different things at different times, or one person in the team say one thing and another person say something else, or that one person say one thing one day and something else a different day. It is a very strange team. I know that Trump likes to call it uh, strategic uncertainty, if I'm not mistaken, but it's definitely not strategic and it's not uncertain. It is chaotic, it is a mess, and it does raise questions that even if the United States does come to some sort of decent agreement with Iran, who's to say that the next day we won't wake up to a new social media post, Truth Social, of Trump's and see that he's wrecked the deal altogether? We just learned that Trump has threatened iPhone. He's or Apple. And their production of the iPhone. He's threatened the European Union. All of this within the last few hours. So this is a big mess, and I don't think that the Iranians well, any of us can predict what will happen in the days and weeks ahead when it comes to the nuclear negotiations, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the tariff war, when it comes to anything that has to do with Trump.
Talking about behind closed doors, I want you to talk us about Israel, of course, because 3 days ago, CNN published a detailed report saying that the Israelis are secretly planning to strike Iran. They quote multiple unnamed intelligence sources, both from the United States and Israel. But it does the report seems to be very confident that they have concrete knowledge about Israel making all the preparations in the event of these negotiations not going the way they like. I also wanted to add that Iranian Foreign Office spokesperson Ismail Baghail told us that Witkoff had to leave a little bit earlier because his flight was scheduled. But I also read that a US source said that he had the time to speak before that in Rome with the Israeli Strategic Affair Minister Ron Dermer and the director of Israel's Mossad spy agency, David Bernia, before the meeting even started. So, talk us about how much hostage the Zionist lobby is trying to keep insofar as this deal is going forward.
Well, the United States or the Trump regime and the Biden regime were both hostages on, throughout the last 20 months. And they've been executing a Holocaust alongside the Israelis, something that we haven't seen since well, actually, we've never seen such a thing happen in human history when such a genocide has been carried out in front of the global population 24 hours a day, every day. Uh, that's something that the world has never experienced before. I would imagine that Washington recognizes that this has destroyed U.S. credibility, it has destroyed the image of the United States and the collective West. So I would assume they do recognize that they are hostages of the Zionist lobby and the neocons who are willing to sacrifice the United States for the Israeli regime. Um, Now, to what degree are they uh, forced to obey the Zionist lobby? That's an open question. We don't know what goes on behind closed doors, but we know that they have huge influence. However, there are a couple of things here. One is that the Iranians have said very clearly that no enrichment means no deal, and there's nothing ambiguous about that. There's no ambiguity here. And so no matter what the Israelis say, the Israeli regime, whatever their officials say, if the Americans don't come to terms with this reality, there's not going to be a deal. So they have to make a choice, either uh, raise the stakes or to accept a meaningful deal. That's the choice that the Americans have to make. The second, which I think is uh, even more important, is that this is not leaked information by the Israelis, or the Americans have not discovered this. American intelligence agencies haven't discovered this. The Israeli regime, if they want to carry out an attack, they're going to have to do it with the Americans. They cannot carry out an attack without the Americans. The last time when they struck Iran and they carried out a major airstrike, which largely failed a few months ago, the Americans were deeply involved, and their radar bases in Turkey across the Persian Gulf were key. Their refueling capabilities were key. So without the American presence, the Israeli regime wouldn't have been able to carry out an airstrike of any a meaningful airstrike. So right now, the Americans, I have no doubt that if there is any such plan, the Americans are involved. It's not as if they're trying to figure it out and then they leak it to the CNN. So why would they pretend that they are discovering this information and then they leak this discovery to CNN? They want to keep a distance between themselves and the Israeli regime for the time being, and I think they also want to put pressure on Iran and to create fear in Iran among ordinary Iranians that an airstrike may take place. But that's not going to have any impact at all. The Iranians have already said that the red line is enrichment. And there is a good reason for this. There's more than one reason. One is that in the past, when Iran needed enriched uranium at 20% for the Tehran experimental reactor, uses medical isotopes for hundreds of thousands of cancer patients. every year, the Americans prevented Iran from importing the uranium. So the United States weaponized nuclear fuel to kill Iranian cancer patients in order to put pressure on the Iranian government. Also, the Americans, at one point, the Iranians had a shortage of gasoline. They weren't producing enough gasoline because in Iran, gasoline is heavily subsidized. So the consumption is very high. It's, I think, 1 or 2 cents a liter, between 1 and 2 cents a liter, which is, I'm sure your audience would be shocked, but that's just how it is. So it's heavily subsidized. Gasoline in Iran is almost free, and you can imagine how much that encourages people to consume. So for a period of time, the Iranians had a shortage of gasoline, and they had to import it, which is very expensive, by the way. But the Americans wanted to block Iranian imports of gasoline because gasoline is what fuels the economy. So the Americans wanted to create a shortage of energy in the country to create an economic crisis. Well, the Iranians quickly went and developed more refinery capabilities, but the point is that the Iranians are very sensitive about being vulnerable to the United States on anything that has to do with fuel. And enrichment also has to do very much not only with the Tehran experimental reactor and producing medical isotopes, but it is used for ordinary nuclear power plants. And Iran has one. And Iran is planning to develop a host of power plants, especially not just for electricity, but for desalination, because there is a shortage of water. And Iran has many major projects to use water from the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Uh, and desalinate it and take it to cities in central Iran which have a shortage of water. So Iran is planning to build a host of power plants. Now, if Iran is not, if it's not sure about its uh, energy, about its fuel for those power plants, then that could create another crisis. So Iran has to have the ability to to produce fuel for its nuclear power plant and in future its nuclear power plants, and also to be able to produce um, medical isotopes and other things. It's used in agriculture. It's nuclear energy is used for many things, industry. So the point is that Iran does not want to be vulnerable to the United States because the United States is a brutal regime. It will do anything to hurt a nation in order to get its way. We see what they're doing in Gaza. The Americans are more than willing to exterminate the Palestinian people in order to get their way. So Iran knows that it is facing a brutal and barbaric enemy, and that it has to have the ability to protect itself, and therefore it has to make the fuel cycle indigenous.
I think this is absolutely critical. The the point about economic uh, independence and energy security and sovereignty for Iran, given on Thursday, a day before the talks were due, the United States Department of State announced new sanctions on Iranian construction sector. I think that that reinforces the point you are making that the United States cannot be trusted if Iran has to follow its independent path of economic development and its to even reach its civilizational position in the region.
Absolutely. The United States is the enemy of not just of Iran, it's an enemy of the Iranian people. The Americans will do anything and they will try to create any harm possible in order to get their way. Look at what they're doing to Cuba. Cuba is a country, a tiny country, so, a small country. I don't want to uh, diminish its significance. Cuba has a rich culture and wonderful people. I spent 24 hours in Cuba, but I know Cubans and I admire their culture and society. But it's a small country. The Americans will not let it go. They will try to strangle the people of Cuba till they bring them to their knees. The same is true in Venezuela. The same is true in any country like Syria. So the Americans are targeting all sectors of the Iranian economy in order to crush ordinary Iranians. They are preventing Iran from um, importing medicine or medical supplies or the raw materials for factories that produce medicine in Iran. They prevent banks from, they say they don't, but in reality they do. In theory, they make these exceptions for uh, like the medical sector, but they lie. They do not allow the Iranians to use the banking sector, and they warn companies, medical companies, not to work with Iran. So that's the sort of brutality that Iran is confronting. And as I said, fuel is the key to the economy. So if Iran is producing nuclear energy, and suddenly its power plants stop working, that would create a crisis in the country. If Iran needs gasoline for its economy and it cannot import it or it doesn't have enough, that creates an economic crisis in the country. Energy is what drives the whole economy. All of the other, so when the Americans are targeting the construction sector, imagine if they're just targeting the sector which just builds homes and buildings for civil society. Imagine what else they're trying to do against Iran.
And n- given South Korea is now producing so much nuclear and energy, now recently, I'm not sure if you read it, German chancellor said that we would not object to anything about France producing more and more nuclear energy. This has been a matter of great debate even within Germany. And now that they have committed the suicide of warring with Russia, there are more vocal voices now within Germany that it was another suicide to give up on our nuclear program because they don't have energy security. I want to come back to a point you made earlier that the Israelis need the Americans if they have to think about this misadventure of militarily engage with Iran. And a lot of Western defense analysts are concurring to that point. They're saying that the Israelis don't have, as you said, media refueling uh, capacity. They also don't have the penetrating bombs that would be needed to attack the nuclear sites. On the other hand, we see a lot of jingoism and confidence and hubris on the side of Israelis that we would go ahead by ourselves. We don't care about the intelligence. We don't care about the radar system. We have it all. Uh, do you think that's a reasonable position at all?
No, the Israelis do not have the capability to strike Iran. If they did not need the Americans wouldn't have been so heavily involved when they did attack Iran a few months ago. They didn't need them. Why would there have been so many uh, planes to refuel their jets? Why were the uh, radar stations across the region mobilized to help the Israelis? That's just bravado. And the same is true about everything in Palestine. Without the Americans and the West in general, but the Americans in particular, they couldn't continue this campaign against Gaza for a week. It's 24 hours a day. Weapons and ammunition and aid is going to Israel so that they can carry out this extermination. The Europeans and the Americans, if they if, you know, they constantly have the Americans have an air bridge. They're constantly sending weapons to assist with the extermination of Palestinians. And if the aid stopped, the Israeli regime's armed forces would the army would grind to a halt within days. The regime would collapse within a short period of time. So the only reason why they can just keep killing, whether it's in Lebanon or whether it's in Gaza or whether it's in Syria, is because the West will give them everything they need, and they can keep people um, um, fighting, and the Americans will give aid and the Europeans will give them aid so that the economy, which is damaged, at least it could keep functioning. So the amount of direct and indirect assistance that goes to the regime is huge. It is unprecedented. And therefore, they're really in no position to pretend that they do things and decide things on their own.
Professor Marandi, if you could tell us a little bit about the role of Oman here, because it seems to me that Omanian Foreign Minister Badr al-Busadi is trusted by both sides. Uh, Reports are also saying even during the actual talks, he is doing a lot, even at the time of the talks. My question to you is, what's the relationship between Oman and the Gulf countries, given we know that Emiratis, Qataris, and Saudis would be able to leverage a lot on President Trump, given he is now so reliant on them. And if they don't want an unstable Middle East, it would be very difficult for the United States to side with the Israelis, no matter how much they would want it. How much do you think Oman would be able to bring the Persian Gulf on board in warding off this misadventure?
I don't think that it's Trump that needs these three regimes. From what I saw in the images, those three regimes behaved as if the king had come and that the king had arrived, and they were all at his knees, whether, in these different countries. And some of the images were quite ridiculous, especially some of them that came out of the Emirates, uh, with the women, I don't know, shaking their heads or whatever it was. But
Yeah,
the
that
countries across,
directly fits into that Orientalist image.
oh, absolutely. It was quite disturbing, some of the image in general. And Serbians to Trump and the fact that he was milking them in front of the eyes of the world, milking them for money that we know they don't have. None of them have that sort of money. But the way in which they treated him uh, was like just very, very, very odd. But in any case, um, Iran's relationship with, and by the way, none of the countries in the Persian Gulf region won. They, in the past, they did a decade ago, and we know from, or more than a decade, we know from WikiLeaks that they were saying cut off the head of the snake. But now, with the rise of Iran's military capabilities and Iran's advancements, especially in high-tech areas, and we know that through its drone and missile capability, and we saw how the Iranians fired almost 200 missiles towards Israel. The Israeli regime couldn't stop but a few of them. And it wasn't even the Israelis, it was a combination of the Americans and the Europeans. Everyone mobilized to block Iranian missiles, and they really couldn't do much. So I think that this shows how Iran has developed. And these countries, these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, they don't want war because they know that if there is a war, their regimes will collapse. They will no longer be in power. But the difference between and the Americans, by the way, they wanted the Emirates to mediate, but Iran did not accept that. In fact, I think it does show Iran's strength that the Americans wanted direct negotiations and for the negotiations to be in the Emirates. Iran said, no, we will continue with indirect negotiations like during Biden, and we saw that Trump was forced to concede, and that we will not have it, the Emirates have anything to do with it. We'll do it with the Omani government. And the reason is, and the Americans had to accept it. And I think that shows that Iran is speaking from a position of strength. But the reason why Iran chooses Oman is that the Omani government is much more reasonable and balanced and friendly towards Iran than the Emirates or Bahrain, or sorry, or Qatar. Qatar has been supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda. They've murdered hundreds of people in Syria alongside NATO and the Israeli regime and Erdogan, among others. And the Emirates have had a strong history of hostility towards Iran in many areas. Even though the two don't like each other, the Emiratis and the Qataris despise each other. Um, Nowadays they try to hide it, but they still don't like each other. And they are at odds over Syria as we speak, too, among other places. But the Omani government has always shown itself to be in pursuit of peace and stability in the region. And because of that, Iran thinks that it's only fair to let them do it. It raises the stature of Oman, and Iran believes that they deserve it.
On Tuesday, Iranian Supreme Leader said that he does not expect these talks with the United States over Tehran's nuclear program to reach a conclusion. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Well, he did add that he doesn't know. But of course, yes, I agree. When Witkoff says that nuclear enrichment is a red line, that means there will not be an agreement. So the only thing that would change that is for Witkoff in private to say something different. That is the only solution. And what he was saying basically was that if this is what's on the table, then there won't be a deal. But I don't know. He added the I don't know because the Americans are constantly flip-flopping. Witkoff could say something today and then something else tomorrow. In fact, Witkoff just a couple of, I don't know how long ago it was. He said that our only issue is a nuclear weapon and enrichment is, he had no problem with enrichment. And then suddenly on Breitbart, he spoke with Breitbart, and then later, I think just a few days ago, he repeated that Iran cannot have any enrichment. That's again, I think Ayatollah Khamenei was saying that is he was basically saying that if that's the case, then there's no deal. But I don't know part of what he said was basically to say that unless the Americans behave differently behind closed doors. That's how I interpret what he was saying.
One of the things Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said,
And by the
if
way, I think he was also sending a message to the Americans saying that if you're not going to accept enrichment, you're hearing it from me. There won't be a deal. When he says I don't think there will be a deal, he's sending a message to the Americans that with this position, you're not getting a deal. But then the I don't know part of what he was saying is that it depends on you, meaning the ball is in your court. If you, in private you're different, then that's a different matter. But if this is the position that you're going to take at the negotiating table, then there's no deal.
this was laid out very succinctly by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in a one sentence equation like formula for people who have no idea about what's going on. He said, zero nuclear weapons equal to we do have a deal. Um, Zero enrichment equal to we do not have a deal. Time to decide. I think that was very well put. Um, yes, go ahead.
Yes, and we have to keep in mind that just recently Tulsi Gabbard, her office, her organization declared that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. And we know that American intelligence has been saying that since 2003, Iran has not been developing a nuclear weapon. Of course, Iran has never been developing a nuclear weapon before or after 2003. But at least since 2003, the Americans admit, that means 22 years now, that Iran has not been pursuing a nuclear weapon. So um, the, the problem, the real problem is not the nuclear program. The problem is the Israeli regime. The United States uses whatever means at its disposal to put pressure on Iran to help the Israeli regime. That's what ISIS was for in Syria. That's what Al Qaeda was for in Syria, to put pressure on. Remember, um, Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, in a leaked audio, said I think it was at the UN building to the so-called Syrian opposition back then, that we, meaning the Americans, allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on Assad, on President Assad, to make him negotiate. That's how the Americans work. They use any tool in their toolbox. They have no morality, nor does the West. And it was interesting at that time when this was leaked, Western media did not even focus on this. They focused on some other part of the conversation that he had, some silly statement that he made where he said that I lost the debate. I think that was it, the debate on attacking Syria, something like that. I'm not quite sure right now. Maybe your audience they could quickly look and put it in the comment section. But what he admitted was that we're allowing ISIS to advance on Damascus. This is how the Americans work. This is how they function. So the Americans use human rights, I don't know, terrorism, well, maybe global uh, warming one day, but the nuclear program, all to put pressure on Iran to help the Israeli regime. That's basically it. But here, the Iranians are saying, no, you're not going to be able to shut down our nuclear program. And we are prepared to defend ourselves. And so the Americans have to make a choice. Do they want to have a deal and ease sanctions? The smart, if they were smart, they would definitely do that because the Americans are overstretched. They have economic warfare with China. Now they have it with the EU. They have, problems with Canada. They have problems with the Russians. They have problems, and they're carrying out a genocide in Gaza. And they have all sorts of problems at home. So the Americans have too many problems. Trump has too many problems on his plate, too much on his plate, and an escalation with Iran. Have no doubt that the Americans will not win. And the Israelis will definitely not win. They will both, either of them would lose if they push towards military conflict with Iran. And the United States is imposing maximum pressure sanctions. And there really isn't much more they can do. They can sanction. If once I'm sanctioned, I'm sanctioned. You can sanction me under 10 different names or labels, but I'm still sanctioned. It doesn't make a difference. They can keep on adding to the sanctions regime. But the point is that Iran is still doing business. And today it's much easier for Iran to do business than 10 years ago because countries are less intimidated by the United States. The trading mechanisms are much more trading mechanisms that circumvent the dollar and Western financial institutions are much more sophisticated. You have more countries, in most, especially Russia, under sanctions. So there's a huge incentive for China and other countries to circumvent the sanctions. Today, the American sanctions has much less impact than it did a decade ago. Not that it is without pain, and not that it doesn't make ordinary Iranians hurt, or Russians, or anyone else, but it is not as effective as it was a decade ago. And I think that in the years ahead, 2, 3 years from now, maybe even less, with the new technologies and the rise of BRICS and the incentive for countries to move away from the US dollar, especially after the trade war, I think that it will become even more difficult for the Americans to continue using the sanctions regime as a weapon against countries.
Trump administration is losing at several fronts. They've definitely lost with China, in Yemen, with the bond vigilantes, the Federal Reserve. Trump was very confident when he came in that he would be able to rein in and push the interest rates down. That never happened. Now
Yeah.
he has taken on the major corporations, the Apple, Samsungs, and I mean, he's saying that that would be imposed on Samsung as well, not just Apple. So the stock markets is reacting very sharply now. The dollar has fallen to historic low, as low as in 2023. And I think now it seems that he's even losing against Harvard. That's something we will see, but that's how it is going. My last question, very brief, unless you want to add something.
No, I was just saying that also the bond market is always an issue, and you're right. Trump was unable to force Powell to do anything. He threatened to remove him. He had to back down. He's not doing well anywhere.
My last question, very quickly, given you mentioned something very important, and I don't think it, the terms of the discussions are set in that way often in the mainstream media. You said the nuclear program is not the main issue. The main issue is, as you said, the Zionist regime. I was just curious if you think a replacement of Netanyahu could be of any help. We're not talking about the collapse of the regime as such, but if Netanyahu is to fall, which is not very unlikely given he is counting, it seems like he's counting on his days. Shin Bet was at the verge of finding something close to corruption, fraud, and so he forcefully removed the Ronan Bar and with his own person from outside, Zain David. He has also taken on his own attorney. People are protesting on grounds because they rightly think in their self-interest that by escalating through the so-called Gidon chariots operation, the hostages' lives are the sacrifice for his own power. So if if hypothetically if Netanyahu falls, would that lead to any meaningful change in the relationship with Iran?
Well, I think over the last 20 months since this extermination has begun, uh, it it was pretty clear that ultimately this Netanyahu will be sacrificed. All of these wars, the expansion of the war, the slaughter and the continued genocide in Gaza, the expansion of the war into Lebanon, the destruction of so much of Syria, the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, all of this, the strike against Iran, the assassinations, all of this, I think, was done to partially to preserve power by Netanyahu, and he keeps escalating, and he's destroying the regime. When you look across the world, it's become a despised regime, and now we're even seeing Western media and high-profile figures turning against the regime, something that's really unprecedented. And so ultimately, I think
And
Netanyahu will
France
be.
and Britain now
Oh yes, and
condemning.
Canada. That's right. Even though at the moment it's just token, but it is significant in its own way. And every day that this genocide continues is going to make things much worse for the regime. It's all downhill. It's delegitimized itself in the eyes of so many across the world who didn't think this way before, who didn't know the reality of this regime in the past. So I think it is inevitable that he will ultimately fall. I think it's pretty certain that that's going to be the case. And he will be scapegoated, and they'll try to say, well, Germany, the problem was Hitler, and Germany was fine, and everything was good, and it was just Hitler that did this, and no, but that's not the truth. We know from polls, just a recent poll that came out, that overwhelmingly, the Israeli, the Zionist population of Palestine want to completely ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Gaza, and roughly half of them say that in cities where they take over, the population must be uh, destroyed. They must be mass. They must carry out mass murder. This is a truly sick society. This is as sick as it gets, and I don't think there's any such society anywhere else in this world, at least in contemporary history, that has such sinister thoughts predominant among its population. So I don't think there will be any real change. It may provide an excuse for or an opportunity for the regime to back down and for the West to uh, de-escalate. That is possible, but it's not going to change anything fundamentally. As I said earlier, the problem between the United States and Iran, or the problem the United States has with Iran, is Palestine, and it is because Iran says that apartheid and ethno-supremacism must end, both within the 1967 borders and beyond the 1967 borders. That makes Iran unique among nations. Other countries, Muslim countries, non-Muslim countries, are saying that within the 1967 borders, ethno-supremacism, racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing is okay. Outside, not such a good idea. So for the Iranians, they say no, this is unacceptable, and that is why the United States is so hostile. And ironically, Iran is, I would say, the one country in West Asia and North Africa where anti-Semitism and that sort of accusation doesn't work. If you look at the Iranian narrative on Palestine, always been very careful to make a sharp distinction between Zionism and Judaism. And you have a Jewish community in Iran, you have many synagogues, you have kosher restaurants, you have Jews invited to Iran from different parts of the world, anti-Zionist Jews. They come to conferences, they come for pilgrimage. Uh, this doesn't work, and Western media can say what it wants. But for Iran, the only thing that is important is that ethno-supremacism must end, and Jews, Christians, Muslims, and everyone in Palestine must have equal rights. This is something that is totally unacceptable in the West. The West that pretends it supports human rights, the West that until just a while back was going woke, and uh, they were willing to recognize all sorts of things in the United States, but nothing in Palestine and nothing for the Palestinian people. So that is the main issue. But the problem is that the balance of power in the world shifted away. And once upon a time, Iran was under huge pressure. Remember, when the Americans were sanctioning Iran, the global south was still weak, and Russia and China were just beginning to rise. And the United States was the hyperpower. And at that time, Iran was supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and so on, but it was paying a heavy price because it was based upon its ideology to help the Palestinians liberate themselves. Just like after, you know, during the Shah's period, I think it's 90% of the fuel consumed by apartheid South Africa was provided to it by the Shah's regime. As soon as the revolution happened, all that fuel was cut off, and Iran broke off ties with the South African regime. The Shah of Iran also provided the Americans with fighter jets to use in Vietnam. The revolution ended that. The revolution ended Iran's relationship with the Israeli regime, shut down their embassy, and made it a Palestinian embassy. So the Americans find Iran's position intolerable and unacceptable because the Americans support racism. They support ethno-supremacism. And therefore, but as I was saying, the tide has turned. We now have a much stronger Iran. We have a much stronger global South. We have a declining West. I'm not saying that the West has collapsed, but the balance of power has shifted. Iran is no longer surrounded. The Americans were in Afghanistan, they were in Iraq, they were in the Persian Gulf, they were in Central Asia. That's changed. Iran today has a very powerful indigenous uh, military capability. Iran today has learned to circumvent the sanctions and to get on with life with difficulty, without despite the United States. And you see countries across the world tilting towards Iran and away from the United States. That's what we see. You know, Iran is now a member of BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The world has changed. So Netanyahu, he may go, but the problem won't be solved. But I believe that the Israeli regime is dying, and the world is witnessing the evil of the regime and the true nature of the regime. And it cannot survive this. And every day that goes by, this hatred towards the regime and its racism and its genocide is becoming more deeply entrenched among people across the world. Every day, every crime that they commit, it's only making it worse for themselves.
I think there needs to be a lot of more literature among not Iranians but non-Iranians, international audience about the internationalist role of Iran since 1979. Because even those of us on the left who like to believe or live in this with this idea that all humanity is same and we need to learn more and more about everyone else, we generally talk about Cuba, we talk about Russia, North Korea during the Chinese Civil War, and China to some extent when we talk about international roles. But listening to you, I think that there is this huge dearth of information about, or maybe that information is there, but given so much of that Iran lobby, let's say, in the United States exists, that portrays the Shah's regime as a liberal utopia where women could dress as they wanted in their small little bubbles and enclaves, and then everything was taken over by the Islamists. We don't hear about that, and I think that's a. We often talk about the Israeli lobby. I recently spoke to Juan Gonzalez of Democracy Now, and we discussed Cuba, and he said, one of the problems about Cuba is the Cuban lobby in Florida, in particularly. He referred to Marco
Of
Rubio and
course.
other. I do think we have an Iranian lobby which is extremely brutal, that harbors in the United States.
Without a doubt, and of course they work under the Zionist and neocon umbrella, and so that makes them particularly evil and brutal. But you're right. I mean, when the United States were trying to take out Venezuela and they imposed all those sanctions, the Iranians went and helped Venezuela to restart their to fix their electrical power plants, to revive their refineries. The Iranians have been trying to help Cuba. Yes, I think that there's a lot that people across the world don't really understand about Iran because they are influenced by Western media. And Iran's culture of resistance is deeply influenced by the prophet, his family, his grandson who fought in Karbala. The story of Imam Hussein is something that is probably has the biggest singular impact on Iranian culture, where standing up to the despot, to support the disenfranchised and the people, and being unwilling to accept humiliation. That is huge in Iranian culture. That is the essence of Iranian resistance, and it's something
Yes.
that few people know.
Yeah, I think that explains why it be like so ignorant to not think about the resilience of Iranian resistance, because that's not something 100 years old. That's hundreds and hundreds of years old. And I just ended on this note. I mean, you and I can go on and on because it's so interesting. I recently went to a fantastic art museum. I wouldn't name it where, but I entered the Iranian section there, and I had an idea of it because I like reading history, but even the pre-Islamic, the depth and richness and diversity of the pre-Islamic heritage in Iran. It's just mind-boggling, from the polished pillars to the statues of elephant heads to the pottery, b- the artistic designs, including floral designs and so on. The scripts that influenced the legal code of Hammurabi and so on. It was incredible, and one has to see the depth of the Persian civilization to understand where they are coming from.
Well, I
That's my
think the
view.
problem is that in the West, for the most part at least, they don't have a great the elites don't have a great appreciation of civilization, especially the United States, because they don't have much of a history, and they don't appreciate the how civilization state, and how different civilizations impact uh, the contemporary inheritors of those civilizations, and it the impact is enormous. But the United States, since it's only 200 some years old, it really underestimates the significance of the role that civilization themselves and their community society. And that's true, especially across Asia and North Africa and the Americas. People were there for a long time before the Americans went there, but that's for another day.
We'll leave it there, Professor Marandi. I promised you a very short and quick response, but we veneered into other places. But thank you for your patience, and thanks for placing these journalistic reporting on the diplomatic events to declutter them and place them in the larger context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.